How do you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as part of U.S. history?
Well, racial discrimination is a part of U.S. history, unfortunately. It led to the bloodiest conflict in the history of this country, where over 600,000 of our fellow citizens were killed. So it's there. It existed after the Civil War. I know there are still elements of that exist. So as a part of teaching history, if you don't teach that, then you're not teaching history. I also do not believe that the United States is systemically racist. I do not believe this community is systemically racist. I was raised here. I went to school here. My kids have gone to school here. I was a basketball player at the University of Wyoming. My teammate and my roommate and my bedmate, because back then, when you went on a road trip, you slept with, they had 2 beds in each room and you had 4 players in a room and you slept in the bed with your teammate. And my teammate that I slept with was Marshall Gadlin, who was my friend and teammate. It didn't matter to me at all what race he was. He happened to be black. But when I hear comments, and have heard comments in the past, that perhaps Cheyenne is systemically racist, or I don't accept it. I just know too many of my friends, and I could list them. I mean, just too many of my friends are minorities, and I just have never observed that. Now I know there are pockets. I believe me, I know racism exists. But to say that we're systemically racist, to me, is an insult to this community and to this school district.
Thank you.
So.
Related to that is the curriculum on teaching racial discrimination in U.S. history that's caused quite a bit of controversy. How do you feel about teaching racial discrimination? What should that look like in our K-12 schools?
We do not teach CRT in our schools. It's never been in the Laramie County School District. It has the term socialized racism, in our communities, has that come up? I'm sure it has. But as far as the actual definition of CRT, that particular idea is not being taught. It's a much higher level theory than we teach at our schools. Having said that, I do think we need to teach history as history is. It's important for our kids to know the good, the bad, the ugly, the fabulous about our country. That's what makes our country great. It's just like in Germany, for example, they have a requirement in the country that everyone that goes through school in Germany has to learn about the Holocaust, has to learn about Hitler and Nazism and the Holocaust, and is to prevent that from happening in the future. So that similar type of thing, we have to look at the bad things that happen along with the good things so that we prevent those things from happening in the future. So making sure history is taught as history happened, I think, is super important.
And how do you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as part of U.S. history?
So racial discrimination is part of our history. Those are facts. And I will always advocate for teaching historical facts. And we shouldn't shy away from those. We want students to be critical thinkers and to analyze situations. And you should present those situations to students so they know how to deal with them and they know how to critically think about them. So I absolutely think we need to teach that. We should not shy away from controversial issues such as, well, it shouldn't be a controversial issue. Essentially, I think we've seen that it's become one when it shouldn't be because it is historical fact.
And when you talk about the controversy, obviously you're talking about critical race theory and the national conversation. You've been in the district for a good many years. Have you seen critical race theory being taught, or do you think it is, or do you think it even is part of the conversation? And if it should be taught, then in what way should it be taught?
Right, so I think this is another example, as I mentioned before, of a national issue coming into local school boards that don't need to be here. It's not, I've never taught it. I don't teach it. But I think that there's definitely a misunderstanding about what critical race theory is. It is not any discussion about race. It is not me having a conversation with elementary students about Dr. Martin Luther King and discussing those issues. That is not critical race theory. Any time you speak about race does not mean that you're indoctrinating students or teaching them critical race theory. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what critical race theory is. But I can tell you it's not being taught in LCSD #1 schools, and I have never taught critical race theory.
How do you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as part of U.S. history?
I think it's really important. CRT was written about in the 70s, but it was implemented with the U.S. Military complex, particularly the Navy. And they started it because you couldn't have a working army if people of two different races were fighting against each other because of the color of their skin. So they set up critical race theory and helped teach it to the soldiers so they would all work together. It's the same in schools. If we do not teach the kids how to work together as a solid people, we don't have a solid people. The other thing is, if we never look at the ugly parts of our history and we never acknowledge them and never do anything about it, we've lost the future. This country is not all one race. We are a melting pot. It's one thing that they've always said about the U.S. in U.S. history. If we don't learn about the different cultures and don't work together to become one people, regardless of our skin color, then we're already divided, a house divided. So it's very important we learn the history. It's very important we work on making changes so that we can have a better future.
How do you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as part of U.S. history?
Well, it's part of U.S. history. So I think it's pretty obvious that it needs to be taught. Just because you don't teach it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And if you don't teach it and you don't discuss it and you don't bring it to the forefront, how are we not to repeat it? History is history. And it doesn't matter, you know, we're talking about crusades, it's a brutal, world history is brutal. Yes, we have a black eye as the United States in some of our issues of, you know, regarding slavery and racial discrimination. Are we still dealing with that? Absolutely, absolutely. And by teaching those things of how it was, we can learn and be better. So any part of history, any part of, you know, books that say, you know, that white people were upset because the little, you know, African American girl went to school, that's not racial discrimination. I mean, that's not, I think we're in a place where we can't even call people, you know, what they are or what it was, I guess. And that's bothersome because, yeah, the white people were angry because, you know, she went to school, but that was that time and day, and it's, how do we learn from that and grow? If that had never happened, we wouldn't be where we are today. And so, you know, if we don't teach it and learn from it, we're doomed to repeat it. Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as part of the U.S. history?
Racial discrimination. So here's something, first of all, I'll tell you, I don't like it. And here's why. Because we have so much great history out there, and I know that bad things have happened. I totally get that. But when I have grandchildren who are Hispanic that come home feeling less than, feeling inadequate, I have a problem with that. Or I had a grandson that I'm embarrassed to say this, but it was a Civil War thing. And he looked at me because I'm white. And I said, I'm not that old. And we laughed about it. He was second grade. And we had to make that distinction that this happened in our past and we've learned from our past and we need to continue to learn from the mistakes of the past. But we have some really great things that have happened. And maybe if it's balanced more, and I know that there's some really great history websites out there. I know that in elementary school, because I have friends who specifically ask this, we don't have a curriculum for that per se. Teachers just grab some things and try to incorporate it in. And that I went, oh, okay.
So you're saying there isn't a curriculum for teaching racial discrimination as part of history, and there needs to be? Is that what
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when a teacher teaches it in such a way that my grandson and granddaughter come home feeling bad,
right.
that's a problem.
Sure.
So
and do you think
I
that's
just
widespread? Is that happening throughout the district? Do you get
I don't know. I don't know. I can't comment on that. I just know what happened with my kiddos. And so I always try to tell them, you know, these things happen. Like I've talked about this, about the Civil War era and all that. And I say, think about how many people fought for their freedom. Think about that. Think about all the things that this president did to fight for their freedom. And we try to go at it that way. Yes, some bad things happened, and we just go from there.
You touched on a little bit by talking about critical race theory, but be more specific, if you would, about how you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as part of the U.S. history curriculum. What should be taught? What maybe should not be addressed at the K-12 level?
Well, I'm going to say something, Brian, maybe. I used these when I grew up in elementary school. I was always fighting about race, about being called a name, about being called whatever, okay? Then I learned how to use this, okay? And I was taught that, how to use this. Get away from this and learn this, okay? So, I'm always learning. I'm always looking to learn. I'm always looking to create an environment for learning, okay? Critical race theory is simply just about learning. Learning history, learning the bad parts, celebrating the good parts. Because we know we have bad parts in history, Brian. We know that, but we can't shut that off. We cannot shut that off in terms of learning. Kindergarten child, okay, whatever. At what age do they start learning? I mean, I see my 2.5-year-old grandson, and I know his brain's going like crazy learning. You know, I see my 16-year-old granddaughter, and again, she's in high school, but I know that brain's clicking. So, it's a matter of stop being afraid of change. Stop being afraid of what you think is different. Diversity is about having this rainbow of color. Okay? Hate is about closing that rainbow and shutting it off. I don't deal in hate, Brian. I love that rainbow. I'm a diversity guy.
How do you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as part of U.S. history?
Really, really good question. Hot topic. I feel that it is extremely important that we are teaching the facts of our history. Now, slavery and how horribly Black people were treated is the truth of our American history. But so is how hard we fought to get the freedoms for Black people. That also needs to be taught. I think teaching discrimination just shouldn't be in our curriculum. It shouldn't be a thing, it shouldn't be addressed. And I'm not to say we're turning a blind eye to it because it's still very much a thing, but instead of teaching and so clarify your question, teaching discrimination, what's an example? Is
So, I mean, obviously, critical race theory has been a big debate. We're not talking about that because we're assuming that it's not in our curriculum.
Right.
Just as far as it being part of history, as you mentioned, should it be taught as part of our history, or should it be kind of glossed over or not even?
No, I think that needs to be addressed. Again, I think we need to just make sure that we are teaching the truth of our American history. And the truth is that Black people were treated horribly for, I mean, years. I did not love history class, so I can't tell you how many years. But it's important that they understand where we were and how far we have come. And that, I mean, again, not to say that discrimination isn't prevalent now, but how we have laws that protect the equality of everybody, and how America isn't a discriminative, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not a discrimination nation as a whole, and we fought so that it wouldn't be. So I think to gloss over it and say, oh no, they weren't treated that way is just lack of being honest with our kids. Now, that being said, I think there's an age appropriateness as to what they're exposed to and when, but I do think it's incredibly important that the kids are taught the truth of our history.
So I said critical race theory. You said at the beginning that this is a hot topic, and I assume that's why you brought it. Or why did you say this is a hot topic? Let me ask.
Just, I mean, with all this social justice stuff going on right now, like kids are, I mean, it's more so than when I was growing up. They're just gonna be more aware of it earlier, and teaching them like, hey, this isn't okay. And like right now in our current time, like we all have equal rights and all should be treated equally. And people fought so hard for that to be true. And so addressing that and making sure that we, like, people know that, like, no, it's not okay to say or do things that's going to belittle any kind of race or gender or ideology or whatever it is, and that there's a way that you can, I think what people are missing, especially with this topic, is that there is a way to coexist and do life together without absolutely hating each other in disagreement. Like, okay, we disagree, great, let's move on. Like, we don't have to sit and talk about who's right and who's wrong. Like, ultimately, like, we as people are supposed to be calling each other higher, supporting each other, every race, every gender, whatever that may look like. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it sure does. At the same time, we know there are situations with racial discrimination in our community.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard recently about black students being called the N-word as they get off the school bus, military families leaving town because they just can't take it being here. So how does that fit with what you're saying about what should be taught in schools? Is that something where we just address individual bad actors, or do we try to educate all students collectively to keep those things from happening?
I think it kind of goes hand in hand with the specific instance of the bus. Like, our district needs to be better at following up with our no tolerance policy. There needs to be discipline for their actions, or else we're teaching their kids they can walk all over anybody and there's gonna be no consequence for it. And that's just not true. When they go into the real world, they're going to have consequences for their actions. And I think it's really important that we implement that now in our teaching our kids now. Hey, if you're gonna do or say something that's not appropriate or not kind, there's going to be a consequence for your action. It's like in the school district should have the highest standard, because we're a lot of kids may not be being taught that at home. And so I think that addressing the issues as they come up appropriately, and I don't want to say with force, but following our no tolerance policy with all discrimination, all bullying, and then addressing, like, especially like the junior high school age, they're a little bit older to really have that more mature development where they can understand, like, hey, this is not okay. This may have happened in the past and we fought hard so that it would not be the reality today, and it needs to not happen. This is not okay. If you have your opinions, we're not telling you to not have your opinion, but you still be respectful to everybody around you, and you can keep those opinions to yourself. So just teaching more so like I think a lot of people nowadays just kind of are missing a filter. Like, there are things that you shouldn't and really can't say in public. And again, you can't tell somebody not have their own opinion, but there's a way to be respectful. And I think educating our kids on what that looks like is huge.
How do you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as part of U.S. history?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I mean, it's unfortunately it is a part of our past, and I think it's even higher above that, I think it's the role of education to provide different perspectives and talk about controversial things. In fact, in policy, it does state something like, controversial subjects shall not be avoided. Literally, I think it says that. And it may make people uncomfortable. I think as long as we can do it in a very respectful, open way and hear everybody's opinions, the factual information around racial discrimination is there. It's not a question of whether it happened or whether it still exists today. So yes, absolutely, and I think it's our role, especially as we look at going back to kind of the role of education and LCSD1, and probably any school district, is producing well-rounded, valued, contributing members to society. Part of that is how do you treat other people and the perspective of the other people, because even if they stay in Wyoming, they're going to get that as an adult, and certainly when they venture out, they will come into contact with very different perspectives and histories.
Rich, how do you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as the part of U.S. history?
Well, racial discrimination is part of our history. It's an ugly part of our history. But, I think it should not be avoided just because it's uncomfortable. We teach history. Slavery is a part of our history. So I think it's important that our students know that and know what our history is. And one of the reasons why you study history is to avoid making those mistakes again, not to make people feel bad. Nobody's trying to make anybody feel bad. You didn't do it, your ancestors did it, but now you can see the effect that it has. And so a lot of people would say, well, we just need to ignore that part of our history because it makes people feel bad. Well, it's too bad, isn't it? Because, it's not anything that I'm proud of. It's an ugly part of our history, but I think it needs to be taught because it's part of history. You just don't manipulate history. History is history. It's a fact, it occurred, and I think it's not there to be massaged and manipulated to make somebody else feel good or bad, either one. So that's what I think.
How do you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as part of U.S. history?
Well, that's an interesting question, too. There is a national conversation I'm aware of teaching racial discrimination, which gets into all kinds of other issues. But then there's also the teaching of actual factual events that occur in history related around racism. So could you clarify the question?
It's broad kind of intentionally. So How do you feel about teaching, should racial discrimination, which is part of our history, be taught in our public schools? And if so, how do you think it should be taught?
Okay. I do think that we should teach the history of the United States. And in that, I do believe accurate accounts for racism is appropriate and should be discussed. I'm actually a history major, and I also have a master's in history, and I think that you can't learn from the mistakes of the past unless you teach them and talk about them, right? But I would also say that it's equally important to teach and talk about the progress we've made on the issue of racism. We've had the civil rights movement. One of my heroes, Martin Luther King, great man who pretty much single-handedly changed, or started a movement that changed the course we were on. And I think it's very important to celebrate those successes, to talk frankly about challenges we still have, but to acknowledge the work that we've done in that area, because I believe in the ideals of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and they give us hope. and they bring us together as a people. We're not necessarily always going to be able to celebrate that we're there, but if we can say we're on our way and we've made progress, and here's where we came from, which was a really negative past, but that we have a bright future if we continue to work toward those ideals in our founding American ideals.
You start answering the question by mentioning a national conversation, and I know as a board member you've heard some of that in the past 4 years. What's your perspective about the national conversation about this issue and critical race theory and that kind of controversy that's been brought into the local school board setting?
Well, that's what I was wondering if you were asking about, because I think that is not a K-12 issue. It's a theory. It's my perspective is it has undertonings of Marxism that run counter to democratic values, and I don't adhere to teaching our little ones that our system is fatally flawed and that they would, not have a chance in life. I think that's defeating and harmful.
How do you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as part of U.S. history, and what should that look like?
I think that we actually need to teach history as it happened, and we can't hide from it. We can't pretend that parts of our history didn't exist just because they make us uncomfortable. I sadly did not know about the Tulsa Race Massacre until just a few years ago, and I'm ashamed I didn't know about it. I didn't know that Laramie was a sundown town. I didn't know that some of those things were there. I didn't know that we had racist language in our housing covenants here in town. We need to teach the entirety of our history. William Butler, I got to go with an Irish poet here, I'm sorry. William Butler Yeats talked about the weeds and the flowers of our history. He got in a lot of trouble when he supported a play called The Playboy of the Western World. It ran in his Abbey Theatre, and unfortunately for the people in Ireland, it presented Irishmen in kind of a bad light, and so there were riots. But he stood up and said, no, we've got to present all of us, the flowers and the weeds. The same thing is true in this country. We have a history of racial discrimination that is absolutely baked into the system and has been since its inception. And we need to talk about it. We need to look at the documents that were there. We need to see how it started. We need to see how it evolved. We need to see what it looks like now. Because that's the only way that we can actually deal with it. If we don't take a look at the problem and diagnose the problem, we can't apply a cure. So it makes us uncomfortable. It makes us not necessarily so happy, but that's okay. Because if you're always comfortable looking at history, then you're probably not reading the actual history of anything that you're looking at. So in the classroom, it looks, to get the second part of this answer, so I can just talk. We have time, because I'm told to slow down. So in the classroom, it can look a few different ways. So in an English classroom, it includes windows and mirrors. It's my constant phrase. It's Rudine Sims Bishop, but it's the idea that every student needs windows into other cultures and other races, as well as mirrors of their own. And that means every child. So it means talking about books like Dear Martin by Nick Stone, talking about books like All American Boys by Jason Reynolds, Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds, bringing those books into the classroom. The Hate You Give is another really great one. So we can have really productive conversations in an English class with current texts that explore this problem. In a history class, it's going to mean, an American history class, it's going to mean actually looking at what took place, looking at the aspects of history that we might not want to pay attention to. I just read a book about the Alamo that I didn't know, and the racism that was part of the Alamo, the stand at the Alamo, and Texas as a state, the pro-slavery nation that it was at the beginning. I didn't know that either. So learning that isn't something that should happen as a 47-year-old. It's something that we should be able to talk about as we go.
I'm going to follow up by asking you about the three-word term that you didn't use, which is critical race theory. How do you feel about it? Is it being taught in our schools? Should it be taught at any grade level?
So the basic answer is that critical race theory is not now, nor ever has been, taught in Laramie County School District number 1. Critical race theory is a method of structural analysis. So when Gloria Ladson-Billings brought it to education in the mid-90s, she brought it to look at school funding. She brought it to look at school structure. She brought it to look at how classes were put together. She brought it to trying out this new system to just sort of see if we could use it to analyze the growing segregation of schools that was happening, and even within schools to see what's going on. So it is this big picture structural analysis. It's for researchers, it's for administrators, it's for community members to analyze, but it's not part of the school. That level of analysis is nowhere in our state standards. It's not going to be in our state standards. Reading a book about Ruby Bridges is not critical race theory. It's reading a book about Ruby Bridges and understanding what she went through and what she experienced. So I could go off on critical race theory for a while because it's a wonderful theory. It's a fantastic theory. It's a great method of analysis. But that's what it is. It's a big level structural analysis that it's not a K-12 thing. But again, teaching about the Tulsa Race Massacre is not critical race theory. That's just teaching about the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Sounds good, thank you.
I'll give you the short answer. Was that okay?
How do you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as a part of U.S. history?
I think history is important. All of the history is important for us to know about. I don't know, I think it's important to know about, but I also think it's important to not dwell on, I suppose. I can't think of what I'm trying to articulate there. I don't think that in any content area, one part of it should be focused on, and that's the only part of a content area that somebody learns about. Because then it becomes, I'm not actually teaching you everything that happened, or everything that I know about, or we know about this content area in an unbiased way. And I feel like that is what is important as a teacher. I should teach you the content and I should give you the material, but not tell you what you take from it, or tell you that what I am telling you is the right and only opinion and or way.
I'm going to follow up with that by asking you about the controversy over critical race theory. Have you followed that, or what are your thoughts about that, and your thought about it being part of K-12 districts?
For me, from the very beginning, when this kind of started to emerge as a hot button topic, I thought to myself, I personally didn't even hear the term critical race theory and or CRT until I was a college student, taking college level classes. And so that was interesting to me because I thought, wait a minute, what? I didn't realize that was, and also it is it's complex, and I don't think if you got to the bones of it that a kindergartner would be like, yes, I know exactly what you're trying to tell me, and I know I can say critical race theory, and I know, what that is. I don't, that's not real life. With a kindergartner and even up through elementary school. We are all different all over the world, and we need to not be afraid of that, and we need to not teach our kids to be afraid of that. We look different, and we probably have different opinions and morals and the things we probably are teaching our own children. But that doesn't mean that we can't or that we shouldn't coexist. So I don't think teaching kids about different races or having a book that shows a Caucasian kid and a Spanish descent kid, I don't think that should not be in our school, because we all go to school with different kids every day. And it's very confusing, in my opinion, especially for lower grade kids, just because developmentally their brain isn't ready to think that complex, in my opinion, for those issues. It's hard for them to understand, I feel, why they may go to school with a kid who is their best friend that looks different than them, and they might not have even actually registered that until somebody came in and questioned and said, yeah, that kid looks different than you. That kid lives over here, and their family believes this, and so that should be a problem with you. Kids don't naturally think that way, and I don't feel like we as a society should either, or we should push that on them in a classroom.